What if everything you think you know about persecuted healers is only the polished surface of a much darker truth that was deliberately hidden for centuries? Imagine opening a historical record and realizing that every line, every accusation, every punishment was crafted not to reveal reality, but to erase it. When you look closely at the stories of women labeled as witches or dangerous healers, you begin to see that the violence committed against them was far worse than the official accounts allow you to believe. The question that should disturb anyone is simple. Who decided what should be remembered, and who had the power to bury everything that did not serve their interests? For generations, women who held knowledge about plants, childbirth, pain relief, community health, and natural remedies were transformed into symbols of fear. These women were not considered threats because of magic or superstition, but because their understanding of the human body and their influence inside. Their communities challenged the authorities of their time. When a healer cured a fever that local priests could not, or when she guided a birth with skill the physicians envied, she became a problem. And in a society built on control, any woman who held power over life and death became someone that institutions wanted to silence. The distorted narratives about these healers often show them as mysterious figures at the margins of society. But the truth is that many were respected, sought after, loved by their villages. These women preserved knowledge passed down through mothers and grandmothers for centuries. Their techniques were practical, effective, and rooted in real observation. Yet, when dominant powers needed a scapegoat, or when they needed to reinforce their authority, these same women were rewritten as enemies of the order. Their knowledge became evidence of heresy, and their independence became a threat that needed to be destroyed. What they erased from the records is not only the cruelty inflicted on these women, but the systematic effort to eliminate the female presence in healing practices. Behind every accusation, there were political motives, religious anxieties, and social fears that shaped the stories the world inherited. And the deeper you go into these forgotten accounts, the more you realize how intentional this erasure was, and how much it still influences the way we understand history today. This is the moment to question what was hidden, what was softened, and what was completely removed to make the past appear more civilized than it truly was. Have you ever felt that certain parts of history were crafted to protect those in power, rather than to reveal the truth? Your perspective matters here, so share your thoughts in the comments. And before we continue, take a second to like this video and check if you are already subscribed, because understanding this hidden past changes the way we see everything that comes next. The implications of what you are about to uncover extend far beyond a single story, and what lies ahead might challenge everything you believed about these women and the world that condemned them, opening the door to revelations that only get darker from here. As you move deeper into the records, the image of persecuted healers becomes even more unsettling. Because what later generations called witchcraft was often nothing more than the rebranding of traditional female knowledge. The myth of the healer witch did not emerge naturally from the fears of common people. It was shaped, polished, and imposed from the top down, crafted by authorities who needed a convenient explanation for everything that challenged their power. When a woman possessed skills that men could not control, the easiest solution was to redefine her abilities as dangerous. Instead of acknowledging her knowledge, institutions transformed her into a threat wrapped in superstition. This transformation was not accidental, it was strategic. The church and state realized early on that labeling these women as witches offered a way to regulate behavior, reinforce gender roles, and redirect blame for social problems. Crop failures, epidemics, miscarriages, and unexplained illnesses could all be attributed to the invisible work of these so-called witches, turning them into scapegoats for phenomena that early medical science could not yet explain. The myth allowed communities to point to a human face in moments of fear, even when that face belonged to the very person who once helped them. And once the label was firmly placed, there was no way for these women to defend themselves, because the accusation itself became evidence. What is rarely mentioned in official accounts is how easily respected healers were reclassified as witches when political winds shifted. A woman who delivered children for years without conflict could become suspicious the moment a childbirth went wrong, or when a jealous rival complained, or when a local leader saw an opportunity to eliminate a figure who held too much influence. Even the knowledge of specific herbs became suspicious, especially if those herbs affected pain, sleep, or fertility. The more effective the remedy, the more threatening it appeared to the eyes of authorities who did not understand it. The myth also served another purpose. It allowed male-dominated institutions to absorb the authority once held by women. As universities began formalizing medicine, the presence of women in healing roles became increasingly undesirable. If female knowledge was recast as witchcraft, then male physicians could rise without competition. Many early medical texts subtly borrowed from the practices of these healers while simultaneously condemning the women themselves. Knowledge that had been nurtured by generations of mothers and grandmothers was stripped of its origins and repackaged as scholarly discovery. The myth of the healer witch effectively erased its true creators, replacing them with men who claimed ownership of healing arts. This rebranding created a legacy that still shapes the way the past is remembered. The further you look into these stories, the clearer it becomes that what survived in historical records was not an objective truth, but a curated narrative meant to justify the destruction of a tradition that threatened the social order. And as these layers start to peel away, you begin to see just how deep the manipulation went, revealing shadows that lead directly into what was systematically erased next, where the attacks against female knowledge became even more calculated and permanent. As the narrative continues to unfold, the scale of the erasure becomes impossible to ignore. The systematic destruction of female knowledge was not simply the byproduct of superstition or fear, but a coordinated cultural effort stretching across centuries. Every time a healer's notes were burned, every time a midwife's tools were confiscated, every time a woman was publicly shamed for practices grounded in generations of observation, a piece of accumulated wisdom disappeared. What remains today is only a faint shadow of what existed before, a fragmented echo of techniques, rituals, and remedies that once sustained entire communities. The silence in the archives is not accidental. It is engineered. When male-dominated institutions began to formalize education and centralize authority, the first step was controlling who could speak, teach, or be considered legitimate. Women who had learned through apprenticeship, experience, and oral tradition were suddenly excluded, dismissed as unqualified, and later targeted as dangerous. What these institutions never admitted was how heavily they depended on the very knowledge they deemed unworthy. Early physicians documented remedies that had been used by women for centuries, stripping away origin, context, and meaning. They recorded plant combinations, birthing positions, wound treatments, and fever reduction, methods without acknowledging where these practices came from. It was easier to declare themselves pioneers than to admit they were borrowing from those they aimed to silence. The destruction of female medical authority was reinforced by religious narratives that framed women as spiritually unreliable or innately prone to error. This allowed the church to justify diminishing their role in healing, replacing local, community-centered knowledge with a rigid hierarchy. Yet what is rarely discussed is how much of early religious healing traditions were themselves influenced by women. Many rituals involving oils, herbs, and purification mirrored ancient female-led practices. But as clerical power expanded, these roots were obscured, replaced with doctrines that centralized control and erased previous contributors. The past was rewritten not only in legal documents, but in sermons, moral guidelines, and community expectations. The consequences of this rewriting extended far beyond individual reputations. Entire branches of traditional medicine were lost because the women who practiced them left few written records. Their expertise relied on sensory knowledge that did not translate easily onto paper. They understood how a plant should smell when harvested, how the body responded to different textures, how temperature, light, and season-altered potency. These details, passed from mother to daughter, rarely survived when the women were removed. What emerged in their place was a colder, incomplete version of healing, dominated by institutions that valued control over comprehension. As you piece these fragments together, the pattern becomes unmistakable. The disappearance of female knowledge was not a historical accident, but a deliberate restructuring of power. What was once a shared communal resource became a regulated privilege, restricted to those who fit the emerging mold of authority. And when you recognize this shift, the next layer of the story becomes even more disturbing, because the methods used to suppress these women did not rely only on ideology or classification. They relied on force, coercion, and brutal techniques designed to ensure that their voices would never rise again, pushing the narrative toward even darker truths waiting beneath the surface. As you descend into the accounts that survived the centuries, the documents begin to reveal something far more disturbing than accusations or rewritten narratives. They expose the machinery of coercion, a system built to produce confessions that match the fears and expectations of those in power. Many of the so-called records of witchcraft are not testimonies, but constructed scripts, shaped through torture that was justified as necessary for uncovering invisible crimes. These procedures were described with clinical detachment, yet behind each line lies a level of brutality that official history often softened, minimized, or entirely erased. What is rarely acknowledged is how methodical these practices were. Interrogators were instructed not only to extract information, but to guide the accused toward predetermined narratives. The women were confronted with accusations they could not disprove, because the very framework of their trial assumed guilt. If they denied the charges, the denial itself became evidence of deception. If they confessed under agony, the confession validated the violence inflicted on them. And the more a woman resisted, the harsher the methods became. These were not spontaneous acts of cruelty, but ritualized procedures executed under legal authorization. The descriptions of these interrogations show how pain was used to reshape memory, perception, and identity. Women were forced to name accomplices they never met, describe rituals they never performed, and admit to intentions they never held. Some confessed simply because the alternative was death by the same hands that demanded the truth. Others confessed after hours of physical torment that broke the boundaries of human endurance. But what the documents rarely mention is how many women refused, even under unbearable suffering, holding on to their truth until the end. Their resistance, though often erased from the final reports, lingers in the inconsistencies between the accusations and the forced statements. Even more troubling is how many of these interrogations were sanitized in later copies. Scribes softened descriptions, omitted details, or rewrote events to make the trials appear more orderly, rational, or justified. What was once raw violence became a curated narrative. Techniques meant to destroy the will of the accused were reframed as necessary steps for protecting society. The physical agony endured by these women was buried beneath a language of moral duty and spiritual warfare, allowing future generations to view these events with distance rather than horror. And yet, when you allow the shadows between the lines to speak, a different truth emerges. It becomes clear that the goal was never to uncover wrongdoing, but to eliminate women whose knowledge, independence, or influence challenged structures of power. Torture was not the result of hysteria, but a tool of control, a way to fabricate evidence and reshape reality until it aligned with the fears of the age. The more you recognize this pattern, the more you understand how much was deliberately hidden, and how these silences were used to construct a historical memory that favored institutions rather than truth. If any part of this strikes you or reshapes the way you see these women, share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective helps uncover what centuries tried to bury, and each reflection brings us closer to understanding what was truly taken from them. As the layers of the historical record continue to peel back, another pattern becomes impossible to overlook, one that reveals the persecution of healers not as scattered incidents, but as part of a structured and lucrative system. The machinery behind these trials operated with the efficiency of an industry, driven by those who stood to gain power, wealth, or influence from the elimination of women whose knowledge shaped local communities. When examining the tribunals responsible for prosecuting healers, you begin to see that the process was fueled not only by religious fervor, but by economic incentives deeply embedded within the society of the time. The inquisitorial courts amassed significant resources through the confiscation of property, fines, and taxes imposed on the accused and their families. Even the cost of imprisonment, torture, and execution could be charged back to the victim's household, leaving entire families ruined while enriching the institutions responsible for their suffering. Villagers who once depended on a healer's knowledge were now forced to watch as her possessions were seized, her land redistributed, and her reputation destroyed. In many regions, accusations multiplied not because of sudden spiritual panic, but because the system rewarded those who brought women forward as suspects. This structure also encouraged competition among those who administered justice. Judicial officials, clergy members, and local authorities could advance their careers by demonstrating zeal in identifying so-called threats. The more accusations processed, the more authority they gained. Manuals and procedural guides trained interrogators to recognize signs of guilt where none existed, turning suspicion into a professional skill. And the courts themselves benefited from maintaining a climate of fear, ensuring their services remained essential and their decisions unquestioned. The more the public relied on them for protection, the more firmly they embedded themselves into every corner of social life. What is even more unsettling is how quickly the narrative surrounding healers changed depending on political needs. During times of conflict or economic struggle, accusations surged as leaders sought convenient explanations for widespread suffering. Diseases that devastated livestock, storms that destroyed crops, or epidemics that spread unpredictably were framed as attacks orchestrated by women whose knowledge was once used to cure or protect. These women became the embodiment of all the uncertainties that authorities could not control, transforming them into perfect targets. The trials allowed leaders to display power, reassure frightened populations, and redirect blame away from their own failures. Behind this industry of persecution lay a deeper transformation of medical authority. As universities and emerging medical institutions sought to formalize the practice of healing, they viewed traditional female knowledge as a threat to their legitimacy. The elimination of female healers created space for male practitioners to step into roles previously occupied by women. Some early physicians even documented their desire to remove midwives and herbalists from community life, framing these actions as advancements in science, while quietly adopting methods rooted in the very traditions they condemned. By pushing healers into the shadows, the growing medical establishment strengthened its influence and ensured its survival. The more you trace these mechanisms of control, the more you understand how intentional this system truly was. It did not emerge from spontaneous hysteria, but from a network of interests converging around the bodies, knowledge, and identities of women who played essential roles in their communities. And this network would only tighten as the centuries progressed, shaping the next phase of persecution where the ideology of fear merged with written doctrine to create a long-lasting blueprint for suppression that still casts its shadow over the history that followed. As you delve further into the records, the chilling evidence of manipulation and institutional control grows more pronounced. The manuals, treatises, and guides that instructed inquisitors and magistrates reveal a society intent on turning fear into law, and law into a weapon against women who dared to hold knowledge. These texts outlined methods for interrogation, recommended punishments, and suggested narratives that the accused were expected to follow. Every page demonstrates how strategy and bureaucracy converged to eliminate resistance, turning what had once been respected healers into parables of terror, warnings etched into the fabric of every village and town. The way these manuals codified fear was precise. They did not simply instruct how to identify witches or healers. They created an entire ecosystem, in which accusation, confession, and punishment were interdependent. Confessions extracted under duress were treated as proof that the system worked, reinforcing the legitimacy of future prosecutions. Community members were taught to recognize supposed signs of malevolence in women, often attributing ordinary behavior to hidden malice. In this environment, fear became a self-replicating force, with societal pressure acting as an extension of formal authority, ensuring compliance without constant oversight. One of the most insidious effects of these practices was the way knowledge itself was demonized. Remedies that had saved countless lives were reframed as instruments of harm. Plants, rituals, and midwifery techniques were catalogued as dangerous, their historical context erased, and their practitioners forced to navigate an environment where every skill could be weaponized against them. Even when documentation of a healer's life survived, it was often heavily redacted or rewritten, leaving the impression of guilt and misconduct where none existed. The act of recording became a tool not for truth, but for control, shaping collective memory to serve the interests of those in power. Religious institutions compounded this effect by embedding fear in moral and spiritual narratives. Women's roles were reduced to symbols of temptation, danger, or rebellion against divine order. Every cure, every counsel offered in good faith, was reframed as evidence of sin or conspiracy. And the more a healer was skilled, the more dangerous she appeared. The records show that a practitioner who successfully treated a difficult illness could quickly find herself under scrutiny, as excellence was reinterpreted as proof of unnatural or illicit influence. What was once a source of respect became a catalyst for persecution. The suppression of female knowledge was further amplified by the centralization of authority in courts and urban centers. Local practices that had existed for generations were scrutinized, with any deviation from approved methods punished harshly. Women were removed from their communities. Public trials were held to intimidate neighbors, and punishments were crafted to maximize both physical suffering and psychological terror. In effect, the persecution of healers was a carefully engineered mechanism for societal control, intertwining fear, obedience, and the erasure of knowledge into a single cohesive strategy. By tracing the way these manuals, doctrines, and institutionalized practices converged, the broader strategy becomes clear. The system was not haphazard or reactive. It was anticipatory, designed to anticipate resistance, suppress knowledge, and transform authority into an unchallengeable force. This calculated approach would continue to evolve over decades, setting the stage for a later era where the persecution of women reached new levels of bureaucracy and horror, leaving layers of erased histories and silenced voices that demand to be recovered. As the shadows of history stretch further, the accounts of women's persecution reveal a deeper strategy, the deliberate demonization of female autonomy itself. These women were not merely accused of practicing forbidden arts. They were punished for exercising authority, influence, and knowledge outside the boundaries dictated by male-dominated institutions. Every skill, every act of leadership, every instance of independent judgment became a threat to the prevailing power structures. The inquisitors understood that controlling women's knowledge was not enough. They needed to control their very presence and narrative within society. The documents from the trials demonstrate a chilling consistency. Women who taught, healed, or led in their communities were subjected to interrogation techniques designed to fracture their sense of self. The questions they faced were never neutral. They were loaded, manipulative, and psychologically engineered to elicit confessions that aligned with the prosecutor's expectations. Even silence could be interpreted as guilt. These tactics ensured that the power of female healers was neutralized not only physically, through imprisonment or execution, but mentally, by instilling terror and doubt in the hearts of those who witnessed or heard the trials. A community's memory was reshaped, and the very concept of independent women was equated with danger. Historical records hint at the mechanisms used to maintain this control over generations. Those who survived were often forced to relinquish their practices, their writings, and sometimes even their names, effectively erasing them from collective memory. Knowledge that had been nurtured through centuries of experience about herbs, childbirth, mental well-being, and disease was systematically stripped of its origin, leaving later practitioners with incomplete, fragmented understandings. The erasure was not merely punitive, it was preventive. By redefining competence and authority as inherently dangerous when exercised by women, these institutions curtailed the spread of knowledge before it could challenge the social hierarchy. Moreover, this demonization extended beyond individual women to entire networks of community support. Families, apprentices, and neighbors who had relied on a healer were also targeted, either directly or through intimidation. The resulting isolation made it impossible for the accused to rally support or preserve traditions. Entire lineages of practical knowledge were disrupted. Villages lost the wisdom of generations, and the institutional narrative replaced it with fear, superstition, and dependency on sanctioned authorities. The systematic replacement of experience with ideology ensured that the control was total, and that dissent or innovation could be punished swiftly and brutally. Understanding this, the patterns of accusation reveal a terrifying logic. The more a woman embodied independence, skill, and influence, the more meticulously the system sought to dismantle her. And while some stories survive, they are often sanitized, reframed, or obscured, leaving only the faintest evidence of the courage, intelligence, and resilience that once defined these women. What remains is the chilling lesson, the true. Danger in the eyes of those in power was not what these women did, but the fact that they could think, act, and heal autonomously. If this resonates with you, if it makes you reflect on what has been hidden or erased, share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters because acknowledging these stories is a step toward reclaiming what was deliberately obscured, and every perspective helps illuminate the shadows that history tried to bury. The more you trace the fragments of these women's lives, the clearer it becomes that their stories were often hidden in plain sight, preserved only in scattered testimonies, marginal notes, or obscure legal records. These survivors, though few in number, carried the weight of centuries of knowledge and defiance. They moved quietly through towns, offering remedies to the sick and guidance to those in need, while constantly navigating a world that had rendered them invisible or dangerous. Every whispered consultation, every subtle intervention, became an act of courage, a quiet rebellion against the forces that sought to erase them. Some women adapted by masking their knowledge, blending ancient practices with socially acceptable forms of medicine, or attributing their cures to divine inspiration rather than human skill. In doing so, they preserved fragments of the wisdom that authorities aimed to eliminate, ensuring that vital practices survived even under the shadow of oppression. These acts of subtle resistance demonstrate the ingenuity and resilience of women who were systematically targeted. While the official histories ignore their contributions, the impact of their work rippled through generations, influencing midwives, herbalists, and community healers long after the original practitioners were gone. Examining the archives, one can see patterns of migration and concealment. Healers would relocate, often carrying entire repertoires of knowledge with them, careful to avoid areas of heightened scrutiny or political control. In some regions, entire networks of women collaborated secretly, exchanging remedies and treatments under the guise of routine visits or domestic work. The authorities were aware of these networks and tried to infiltrate them, but the decentralized nature of knowledge transmission made complete eradication impossible. This hidden continuity highlights how much information persisted despite aggressive campaigns to suppress it, and how women maintained agency even in the face of extreme persecution. Moreover, the records show that these survivors were often underestimated by the institutions that sought to control them. Legal documents, letters, and trial accounts inadvertently reveal moments of resistance. Women who denied charges with quiet dignity, who refused to betray neighbors or apprentices, who managed to preserve vital cures and techniques while appearing compliant. The combination of resilience, discretion, and ingenuity allowed them to navigate systems designed for their destruction. Each successful act of evasion or survival became another layer in a hidden history, preserved not by fame or recognition, but by the sheer persistence of those who refused to surrender their knowledge or their lives completely. Through these clandestine networks, the wisdom of persecuted healers continued to shape communities. Even when practices were adapted, hidden, or renamed, the underlying principles endured. The traces left in letters, annotations, and oral traditions provide compelling evidence of women's agency, creativity, and determination. Understanding this, it becomes evident that what survives in the historical record is only a fraction of the reality. What these women achieved under constant threat reveals not only their courage, but the extraordinary lengths they went to ensure that essential knowledge would survive. Their legacy is hidden, fragmented, yet undeniably influential, forming a bridge between the erased past and the practices that endured into modern times. The long-term impact of this systematic persecution reaches far beyond the immediate suffering of those women. By targeting female healers and erasing their contributions, society not only lost vital medical knowledge, but also reinforced a cultural structure that devalued the expertise of women for generations. Practices that were once considered essential for community health were rendered obscure or prohibited, while male-dominated institutions established new hierarchies of authority. The deliberate disruption of knowledge transmission created gaps in practical medicine, herbal remedies, and midwifery, many of which lingered for centuries. The subtle consequences of these actions can still be traced in the way certain healing traditions were lost, modified, or reappropriated. Historical accounts indicate that male practitioners often incorporated the knowledge of women into their own work, claiming it as formalized or scientific discovery. This appropriation further erased the origin and context of the practices, creating a false narrative of innovation. What was once communal and female-centered became privatized and institutionalized, leaving generations of women with little access to authoritative recognition for their expertise. Even when remedies survived, the absence of mentorship and community support limited their effectiveness and dissemination. This systematic extraction of knowledge ensured that the power of healing became controlled, monitored, and hierarchically structured, rather than freely shared within the communities that needed it most. The psychological effects of such oppression also reverberated through families and communities. The threat of accusation, public shaming, or execution created a culture of fear that discouraged women from practicing, teaching, or openly sharing their knowledge. Children and apprentices learned to conceal, modify, or even abandon traditional remedies, internalizing the lessons of silence imposed by authority. Fear of social, legal, and spiritual repercussions became intertwined with the very act of healing, fundamentally altering the way knowledge was transmitted. Over time, communities normalized this absence, assuming that the loss of female-guided expertise was natural or divinely ordained, rather than the result of deliberate erasure. Moreover, the suppression of these women distorted societal memory, influencing literature, folklore, and historical records. Stories of healers were reframed as tales of malevolence, superstition, or witchcraft, replacing evidence of skill, compassion, and intelligence with cautionary narratives that reinforced patriarchal control. Even when primary sources survive, they are often filtered through the biases of those in power, exaggerating alleged wrongdoing and minimizing contributions. As a result, modern understanding of historical medicine and community health is deeply incomplete, reflecting the gaps left by centuries of targeted suppression. Tracing these patterns underscores the profound scale of cultural manipulation. The persecution of women healers was not an isolated phenomenon, but a structural strategy designed to consolidate authority, control knowledge, and rewrite social memory. Understanding these mechanisms reveals the depth of what was lost and highlights the resilience required to preserve any fragment of the past. In examining these erased histories, one begins to grasp the magnitude of what generations of women endured, and the quiet influence they managed to exert, despite relentless efforts to silence them. As we reach the final layers of these hidden histories, the scale of erasure becomes undeniable. What they did not record, what they chose to obscure, and what they destroyed reflects a conscious effort to suppress not only the women themselves, but the very knowledge they embodied. Despite centuries of oppression, fragments survived, notes in margins, whispers, passed from apprentice to apprentice, scattered herbs and remedies remembered in memory alone. These remnants are faint, but powerful reminders that resilience persists even under relentless control. By understanding what was deliberately hidden, we confront a reality that challenges every sanitized version of history we have been taught. The accounts reveal that persecution was not only physical, but intellectual, designed to sever the transfer of knowledge from one generation to the next. Each confiscated text, burned manuscript, and censored letter represented a calculated attempt to erase women from the practice of healing. Authority figures did more than punish. They rewrote memory, ensured compliance, and institutionalized fear so that future generations would inherit silence instead of wisdom. Yet, in the shadows, these women's legacies endured. In scattered towns and hidden villages, practices continued quietly, adapted and passed down, like fragile threads of light fighting through darkness. The persistence of these traces highlights a truth that official histories can never fully capture. Knowledge cannot be entirely extinguished when it lives in the hands, hearts, and minds of those determined to keep it alive. Now, as we reflect on these deliberate omissions and the strategic erasure of female agency, it becomes clear that history itself was shaped by power, fear, and the control of memory. Understanding this reality is not just an academic exercise, it is a call to recognize whose voices were silenced and to question which narratives have been handed down as truth. Every fragment of surviving testimony carries the weight of centuries, a testament to courage, defiance, and the quiet rebellion of women whose lives were written out of history. Their endurance challenges us to think critically about the stories we inherit, the truths we accept, and the silences we are willing to confront. If you followed this journey, take a moment to honor what has been uncovered. Leave a comment with your reflections. Tell us if this message resonates with you, if you see the shadows of history differently now, or if you've experienced a moment when truth was hidden and later revealed. Hit like to acknowledge the importance of uncovering erased voices, and make sure you're subscribed to continue exploring these hidden truths together. There is more to uncover, and the lessons of the past are far from complete. The courage of these women, the knowledge they preserved, and the injustices they endured deserve attention, reflection, and action. And now, having come this far, you are part of keeping their story alive.